females to some degree to spread over a very wide area and eventually become part of the first colonization of the Americas. Because when you were able to have microblades, you could make from one piece of stone many tools that you could replace quickly. You didn't have to have access to large amounts of stone, stay closer to areas where you could get that stone. It was really a revolution at that time. And if this is true, then the first migration or migrations that came into Native America wasn't the core of that Juktai culture, wasn't the core of that Q plus A microblade hunting peoples. It was those Pacific Rim peoples who had already become infiltrated by these hunters carrying the Q haplotype, and they became either through some ice-free corridor or probably down the coast in one or perhaps a few migrations from this area that had already been partly interacting with DNA and possibly language. They became the first Native Americans. And their Y DNA was predominantly Q, or maybe not exclusively. Maybe there were remnants of those original Y haplotypes that were in the Pacific Rim. Their mitochondrial DNA, we had the various subclades of B, C, D that were in the Pacific Rim already, and A was added to it. Subclade of A was added to it with the microblade hunters that were the Q haplotype of the Y DNA. And I wonder if this scenario is true. Maybe these microblade hunters who were so migratory and were so successful at moving across and exploiting resources with their mobile technology, maybe the very impetus to move into the Americas came from them into these Pacific Rim populations. This is complete speculation, but it's worth at least thinking about. And we don't know how many original migrations came into the Americas before the Na-Dene peoples themselves came in. It is very possible that there were some down the coast, maybe some inland. It is also possible that groups that eventually became the Algonquins were all a little bit later than the very first peoples who came in, and they brought in this X2 haplotype, very unusual, that seems to be associated with Algonquin populations. Why this is important is that the core of the Juktai culture, which would eventually give rise to the Kets males and also the Na-Dene people, they were probably in closer proximity to some of the Native American groups, the inland hunting Native American groups, and this would explain why Algonquin folklore has so much connection with Na-Dene folklore and also Ket folklore. Okay, and Ket folklore is not connected with other Native American groups that are farther to the south. So this kind of a scenario would explain that. Na-Dene ancestors, did they come in 12,000 years ago or later? We don't honestly know, but they had to have been there long enough for them to pick up this new male haplotype, the C3 haplotype, and bring it into the Americas. I don't think it was FedExed in later after they had already gotten into the continent. Okay, so this scenario that I provided to you, which is hypothetical, but it's an attempt to triangulate what we know about archaeology, material culture, Y DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and also language. It does at least offer a plausible explanation why the modern Kets share most of their Y DNA with all Native Americans, some of their mitochondrial DNA with all Native Americans, but particularly with the Na-Dene and some of the other northern peoples who presumably would have come in from the inland culture, and the folklore with only some specific North Americans, and language only with the Na-Dene, because that language core would have been ancestral to Na-Dene as well as the Kets. And this hypothesis, microblade hunter Q plus A dispersal hypothesis, would also explain why the Y chromosomes of Native Americans are so much more homogeneous in terms of their haplogroup than the mitochondrial DNA, which is from diverse groups originally. And why the mitochondrial DNA haplotype A, or the A2, is so much more prevalent among some of the northern populations who presumably were more largely from this inland group that was spreading with the microblade technology. This would include Algonquins, but especially the Athabascans. And it would also explain why Na-Dene is not related to any of those other more southern language families in the Americas. This one hypothesis I gave you would explain all of those things simultaneously. And if this is true, then perhaps something like this would be the most plausible homeland of a hypothesized Dene-Yeniseian proto-language, proto-group. It would have to be close enough for the ancestors to become involved with the fisher folk at the southern tip of Lake Baikal and become the modern Ket. Would have to be close enough to Manchuria for the C3 male haplotype to be coming up and getting involved in that population before it moved over into the Americas. But then we run into the second huge problem that has to be answered, and that is the time depth is too long ago for this to seem plausible with what generally historical linguistics posit for how long you can use the comparative method to go back in time. 13, 14, 15,000 years. This seems like it's about 5,000 years too early for the kind of linguistic evidence that I'm trying to show to be plausible. So what's the answer to that? The time depth problem. Very important that has to be answered. And I have an answer for it. All right, there's two pieces of the answer. The first one's pretty surprising. And that is, early in the lecture, I told you that the verb system in all the non-Dene languages is incredibly complex, almost like a chemical formula. In Athabascan Eyak Tlingit, there's a verb template that has positions and morphemes that go into these slots. And this template is so elaborate that people have assumed that it's not very good evidence for genetic relationship, because just like a big strand of protein, it's so complicated that any little change is going to wreck it and it won't be able to survive for thousands of years. But in fact, it turns out that that's exactly the opposite. When studying just the Na-Dene family, it turns out that the Tlingit language has such an incredible similarity in the way the verb is structured compared to the Athabascan language family, that it really looks, if you just look at the verbs, you could imagine that the language families are just 1,000 years apart. But when you look at the vocabulary, it's obvious that they're much more distant than that. And so for much of the 20th century, linguists argued that Tlingit might not really be related to Athabascan Eyak. Maybe it's a mixed language of some sort, because the grammar looked like it's so related, and the vocabulary looked like it was much more distantly related. Now, with the work of Jeff Lear, it's obvious that everything's related. Everything is very interlockingly related with sound correspondences. A lot more cognates have been found. A lot more details of the verb system has been found. And so it gives the idea that this type of verb morphology, this templatic verb morphology, might be something that in fact is very, very ancient and persistent in language. This gave me the idea to team up with Dr. Joanna Nichols a few months ago at the Linguistics Society of America conference, which you very nicely sat through, Ariane, and I appreciate. What we did was we got together leading specialists in 6 or 7 language families, most of which no one would think are related, and well, probably aren't related, to see if this type of verb morphology is ancient in each of these language families. Is it something that looks like it is we would expect to be ancient? And that's exactly what we found. For instance, Joanna Nichols studies the Northeast Caucasian language family, the Anakhtagastanian, and she's found that analogous types of verb structures in that language family may have persisted almost unchanged for 8,000 years. This is something that itself is like a strand of DNA. It's a fantastic way to examine language relationships if this kind of grammar is in the family. So that is part of the answer to the time depth problem. And interesting thing is that many Native American languages have these similar types of verb structures. And my suspicion is that if people very strongly compared not just the basic vocabulary, but the way that the verbs are structured in these various language families, really very carefully tried to reconstruct the verb system in each of the known and proven language families, and then tried to compare those reconstructions across language family boundaries, I suspect that we might be able to demonstrate that instead of 100 or so language families south of Na-Dene in the Americas, we might have something like 10 or 15, who knows, but it would be a lot closer to the mitochondrial diversity that we find in the founding haplogroups. And that's what I suspect could possibly happen. All right. Now let's get to the other half of the time depth problem, and that is the basic vocabulary and these interlocking sound correspondences that has been hypothesized with Na-Dene and Yeniseian. Very few of this evidence is something you can see by comparing modern languages. There are a few words that look alike in modern Navajo and modern Ket that turn out to really be cognates. Very, very few, not enough to demonstrate any kind of linguistic relationship. One of them is famous word birch bark, which really almost is unchanged. I can say the Ket word to elders in northern Alaska and in Arizona, and I tried this, and they know what it means. the modern cat word. There's 5 or 6 words in this whole language families that are like that. Not enough to prove anything. They could easily be coincidence. Most of the lexical evidence is based on reconstructions that have been made by specialists in Yeniseian or specialists in Na-Dene, have been working for many decades to understand the internal diversification of these language families. So most of the evidence is like the cognate word for conifer needles, probably spruce needles, which if you compare these two forms, they still don't look really super alike. But then when you start comparing a lot of these proto-forms that have been reconstructed, you start seeing very specific interlocking patterns. And this is just one of the patterns. In Na-Dene languages, you have a situation where originally you had a nasal, a consonant pronounced through your nose, and a consonant that is almost stopped in the mouth, an obstruent or a fricative, that make a consonant cluster at the end of the word. And what happened in this language family is that in the Na-Dene family, the N deleted or almost deleted, but if you really study the family, you can see that it was there based on internal evidence. In Yeniseian, the exact opposite happened. The N stayed in place just wonderfully, and the D or the S or the T that was at the end, you can only see if you very carefully study irregular plurals or combinations, and it has almost disappeared, but there's internal evidence in Yeniseian that there was a consonant cluster at the end. And there's internal evidence, the exact opposite, in Na-Dene there was a consonant cluster at the end. If you put it all together, you have interlocking sound correspondences that show that all of these sounds in each of these languages, in all of these basic vocabulary words, very, very intricately connected. And these sound correspondences are more than just this one rule. Turns out that whenever in modern cat you have a high even tone in the Na-Dene cognate to that monosyllabic word, you originally had a glottal stop at the end, a glottal catch at the end of the syllable. And this is a regular sound correspondence. If in Na-Dene you didn't have a glottal catch at the end of the syllable, regardless of what consonant or even if there's a consonant cluster there, in cat you have the abrupt tone developing. So there's a systematic correspondence between these different kind of things that go across these vocabulary words that also are paired according to how they dealt with the consonant clusters at the end and the consonants and vowels at the beginning. But if you look at, say, modern cat and modern Navajo, you look at what I think undoubtedly cognates, they don't look alike at all. Okay, the modern Navajo juniper and modern cat spruce branch or conifer branch, no one would ever guess that these were cognates related. Only when you know the internal reconstruction of both of the language families can you see that words like this are actually cognate words. And so the answer to the time depth problem is that maybe it is true that after 10 or so thousand years you really can't see evidence of genetic relationship. But when I'm comparing Na-Dene and Yeniseian, I'm not comparing languages in a 15,000 year time depth. I'm starting out already 5,000 years ago. I'm starting out with internal reconstructions that have been made by some of the best linguists in the 20th century, not by me, and it is those that you can use to see the relationship. And so we're starting 4,000 or 5,000 years in the past. We're not going back 15,000 years. We're going back 8, 9, 10 maybe thousand years. And that is why you can see these relationships. And the idea that time depth is influenced by how well you can reconstruct the internal workings of a language family, I think is a little bit new idea in linguistics. But if you think about it, it completely makes sense. Just suppose that languages, you can't see any relationship after 10,000 years. And suppose Indo-European languages are 6,000 or so years old. Does that really mean that in 4,000 years, like the Maya calendar, poof, there's no Indo-European language family? Obviously, that's not true, because we already have reconstructions that go back several thousand years into the past. And I think that needs to be taken into account when we talk about time depth and what is possible with language relationship. And that is the answer to the time depth problem. It's not a problem at all, thanks to the work that's been done in these respective language families. If we only had Ket and we only had Navajo, there's no way we could prove any kind of genetic relationship, even if it existed.